Well, hi there, stranger. I didn't expect to see anyone here. You know, we don't often get a lot of visitors here at the store, but I can tell by the sight of you that you're looking to venture out into Oregon. I gotta tell you, that is quite the long journey for you to take. I'll be honest with you, I don't know who or what you may encounter out there, but I do know that it won't be easy. I sure wish I had the level of determination and grit that you have to make this mighty passage. Best of luck to you on your journey, and if you do make it, know that I've had your back all along, lest you forget this little encounter that we had. Hello everyone, my name is Michael Caruso. For my final project of this class, I would like to discuss American folk music, specifically a piece with little recognized historical content known as the Wayfaring Stranger. The big question that I will address with this presentation is why study and investigate American folk music? What relevance does it have compared to classical music as we know it or have come to know it through this course? Is it important to consider folk music as containing aspects of American nationalism? And lastly, how does this analysis of American folk music connect specifically to pieces such as The Wayfaring Stranger? I will address all of these questions in the following presentation. This class involves looking at classical music and analyzing the fascination to revitalize and discuss it in a modern-day academic setting. I feel that American folk music should be interpreted the same way as other genres of classical music because it is a way to discover the roots and beginnings of contemporary styles of American music as a whole. Analyzing American folk music also identifies certain trends that distinguishes folk music from other genres. Lastly, as you will find out later in this presentation, there is a calling to use folk music in popular forms of media, and this draws attention to the calling of a desire to further investigate and interpret the meaning behind the early pieces of American folk music. So what exactly is folk music? When asked this question, folk music is most deeply associated with culture and tradition. Early examples of folk music are comparable to epic songs, meaning they are usually orally transmitted through generations with an appeal to tradition and a reliance of descriptive language. Littleton states that folk music is indicated by strong lyrics, simple recording, and a personal performance with acoustic instrumentation, with an emphasis on a folk singer most importantly being a songwriter. Folk music does not rely on orchestral sounds and a strong, lavish performance, but rather it focuses on telling a story with the lyrics of the song, conveying emotion and touching on a deeper subject matter. So now that I've given you a brief summary of what folk music is as a whole, I will introduce the main piece I intend to focus on. According to Steele and Hulan, John Marion Dye is most closely associated with arranging and publishing the song The Wayfaring Stranger in 1936. Dye was a songwriter, schoolteacher, and Methodist gospel singer who wrote more than 200 songs. Dye was also president of the Alabama State Sacred Heart Musical Association starting in 1930. While Dye is most closely associated with the composition of the song itself, the historical context remains a bit speculative even to this day. Steele and Hulan suggest that the song was originally titled the Libby Prison Hymn, and that ballads of the piece were originally sold for the relief of soldiers at the end of the American Civil War. I'm not too familiar with the history of the Libby prison, but I do know from past college classes I've taken on U.S. history that it was a Confederate prison located in Richmond, Virginia. The United Brethren in Christ published the first English version of the song in 1858 as an adaptation of a German piece. I'm not going to attempt this because I'm not too familiar with German, but it's loosely translated to I Too Am a Pilgrim on Earth, written by Isaac Niswander in 1816. There are multiple versions of the Wayfaring Stranger, also sometimes referred to as the Poor Wayfaring Stranger, but all versions contain similar lyrics. The version I have presented here is performed and recorded by Burl Ives in 1944. I will display the lyrics to the song and provide my own translation as to what the lyrics suggest in order to provide greater historical context. The lyrics here are provided by Genius.com. I'm just a poor wayfaring stranger, traveling through this world of woe. I am a lonely wandering stranger trying to live my life in this gloomy, depressing world. And there's no sickness, no toil, no danger in that fair land to which I go. I am seeking a better life free of inhibitions. I hope life will be easier after the journey has been made. The next group of lyrics is where things get a bit more interesting. I'm going there to see my mother. I'm going there no more to roam. Pretty self-explanatory, but this person hopes to see their loved one and become dormant as opposed to constantly being wayfaring or adrift. And finally, I'm just going over Jordan. I'm just going over home. This took a bit of extra research to find, but in religious contexts, and thanks to past theology classes I have taken, it turns out that crossing the Jordan River is a metaphor for entering the kingdom of heaven. In the conclusion of this piece, the stranger is embracing death and hopes to reunite with their mother in heaven who has passed away. As you can see, this piece heavily relies on deep lyrics in order to tell a story. This feels like a musical narrative in which the singer and the minimal instruments that are used do not overshadow the context of the lyrics of the song. American folk music such as The Wayfaring Stranger is an example of the emotional impact that folk music had and continues to have to this day. In terms of how The Wayfaring Stranger has been used in today's media, there are a few examples I will address. The most prominent use of the song in recent media is the 2019 film 1917, which is a movie about the events of World War I. The soundtrack of the film was composed by Thomas Newman, who has worked on the soundtrack of films including Scent of a Woman, The Shawshank Redemption, and Finding Nemo. The version in 1917 was performed by Josh Slovic, and without spoiling too much of the film, is one of the most prominent scenes that the protagonist of the movie goes through. Grieving observes that 1917 is a movie that is full of moments of tension, and that Newman had to use variation in the soundtrack of the film in order for the songs used to feel united with the actions being portrayed on the screen. Simply put, Newman decided to use The Wayfaring Stranger to convey a scene of the movie that contains high levels of tension and emotion felt by the characters. This goes to show how the original composers of the piece intended the song to evoke high levels of emotion, and that it was important for Newman to capture that same level of resolution that the original piece was going for. Besides film, The Wayfaring Stranger has also been featured in the soundtrack of two video games. The first game is the Oregon Trail Deluxe, which was released in 1992 for the MS-DOS, or Microsoft Disk Operating System. The plot of the Oregon Trail Deluxe is that you play as a hopeful explorer attempting to cross the historic Oregon Trail, which spans over 2,000 miles from Missouri to Oregon. This trail is notorious for being very treacherous and dangerous and taking the lives of more than 10,000 people. And the Oregon Trail Deluxe presents an educational experience while providing elements of gameplay, similar to the narration I gave during the opening of this presentation. A rendition of The Wayfaring Stranger can be heard when the player has made a certain amount of progress on the journey of the Oregon Trail, and I believe this is still meant to convey levels of emotion for being so far into the trail and being met with actual daunting challenges, such as the diseases that were very common for those who attempted to journey the trail in real life. In a way, hearing The Wayfaring Stranger provides the player with a sense of being so close yet so far to actually finishing the long and difficult journey, avoiding too many casualties, and finally being able to settle in Oregon. The other video game that features The Wayfaring Stranger is The Last of Us Part 2, released in 2020. The game takes place in a post-apocalyptic US where the protagonist Ellie is trying to seek revenge on a tragic event caused by Joel, a protagonist from the first Last of Us video game in 2013. The Last of Us Part 2 was revolutionary for its time, winning several awards and garnering success from critics. Most notably, the art style and music featured in the game had received suitable accommodation. The soundtrack was arranged by Gustavo Santaolalla, and Maher notes that the music communicates things and levels of emotion that simple dialogue cannot, and the music of the game is also impervious to the changes seen in the exposition that alter the direction of the story. In The Last of Us Part 2, the actors of the protagonists Ellie and Joel performed The Wayfaring Stranger over the ending credits of the game. While I'm not too familiar with the plot of the game itself, I do know that the game tells the tragic narrative of the protagonist, and the use of the Wayfaring Stranger is meant to quell the high levels of emotion in the story of the game and have the player reflect on the arduous journey they undertook during their initial playthrough of the game. For those of you like myself who play video games regularly, you may agree with me that the soundtrack of the game is very effective in either furthering or lessening the overall level of enjoyment found when playing a game. An experiment conducted in 2019 by Klimt et al. Found that having a harmonious soundtrack to a video game amplifies emotions felt during gameplay, provides a sense of immersion to the world created by the video game, and allows video game players to further identify with their respective characters and actions performed within a game. So, having a soundtrack that is cohesive with the environment and atmosphere created by the game develops unity and promotes a greater sense of enjoyment to the player. As it relates to my topic, deciding to use the Wayfaring Stranger in games such as the Oregon Trail Deluxe and The Last of Us Part 2 integrates with the stories created by the game and exemplifies the level of emotion felt through the composer's decision to incorporate folk music into the game's soundtrack. So the question that must be addressed is why composers decide to use folk music as a part of their soundtrack for media. Just as there has been an effort to revitalize and study classical music in a modern-day setting, there has also been an effort to draw attention to folk music and other lesser-known genres. It is not enough to simply decide to randomly place a piece of folk music in a soundtrack without having it connected to the context of why the creators, directors, etc. had decided to specifically use the piece, namely the Wayfaring Stranger. Reville states that folk music and folk culture no longer needs to be filtered in order to provide a sense of authenticity. Folk music is unforeseen and realistic, and folk singers adapt cultural tradition into their specific performances. Crutchfield argues that authenticity unites all folk singers, and a continuous cycle of discovery is received by the public more often than recording companies. This reinforces that folk performances rely on being genuine and emotional, and authenticity remains of the utmost importance when composers and other directors of music decide to utilize folk music in the soundtrack of any form of contemporary media. So you are now familiar with the history and tradition of American folk music and how influential pieces like The Wayfaring Stranger continue to be to this day. The question to address now is, what is the bigger picture? What is the main purpose of me deciding to analyze and discuss folk music in this context for a class based around the influence of classical music? I would say that the most important aspect of deciding to revisit and revitalize folk music had to do with purpose. The directors and composers I had mentioned chose to incorporate the Wayfaring Stranger for an emotional and involving purpose, as opposed to deciding to use folk music because it has a distinct sound from most known forms of classical music. The performance of folk singers has remained in the past and will continue to remain authentic and genuine. And American folk music relies on the singers being able to provide a sort of musical narrative when performing these somewhat unknown pieces of music. American folk music also has elements of nationalism, though not in the traditional sense. When looking at a piece such as The Wayfaring Stranger, for example, it is not overtly patriotic in its context. Rather, it shows the adversity that American people have undergone, and folk music is able to provide a serious narrative behind simply telling a story without as much impact or sentimentality that can be seen when viewing the genuine performance of folk singers. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation on American folk music and The Wayfaring Stranger. This was a very interesting topic to research, and although a lot of this topic remains speculative, it is fascinating to see how lesser-known genres such as folk music continue to be relevant in today's media, similar to how there is an emphasis to view and analyze classical music in a contemporary education. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Michael Caruso, and God bless you.